Hi, I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
Welcome again to Cave to the Cross Apologetics, where we are working our way through the book Truth in a Culture of Doubt. Right? So this is a great book. We are in chapter 2, and there are various claims in chapter 2. Actually, there are 5 claims in this chapter, right? And we've worked our way to the third claim. The first claim, the New Testament authors have contradictory points of view on major issues, right? Well, no, they just have different perspectives, right? Secondly, attempts to reconcile various events in the New Testament are mistaken because such harmonizations create another account that is different from the one being read. Well, that's ridiculous, right? All it does is fills in the gaps and tells us the bigger picture. It doesn't create a different account, right? Yeah. And now we're on the third claim in chapter 2. This claim says that the Gospels' chronological differences are historical contradictions, right? So how they place the various events and accounts chronologically, he's suggesting, they're contradicting in terms of the history, right?
And we covered a lot of these, and there'll be cards above and cards below in the description of our going over Jason Lyle's Keeping Faith in the Age of Reason, where we kind of dig into, well, okay, this does seem like a contradiction. Well, not quite a contradiction, because that whole conversation, but also timekeeping and certain ones. So we went over many of those. So those links will be included as well. Yeah. Here, Ehrman's critique stands only if someone were to try to make the Gospels into something they were never intended to be. Ancient literature from this time period often did not narrate events in exact chronological order. We see that a lot in Matthew, especially. Again, who's he writing to? A Jewish audience. Sometimes when you're making lists, you put the person of prominence first, where we would say, oh, well, I was third born, so I'm third in the list. That would make the most sense. Unless I was super famous, right? Then I would want to be number one.
That's right.
So it depends on what's there. Instead, historical events were arranged for thematic and topical reasons. Now, that's not saying that we're not going to what Lydia McGrew talked about, where you have this. Well, I moved it around for various nefarious purposes, or I wanted to make a point here. So Jesus didn't really do this at the beginning; he did this at the end. But this is talking about needing to read what's actually being done in the text. So this is clearly seen in the gospel as each author felt the freedom to arrange parables, sayings, and other events in view of their particular purpose.
Right. So, for example, Ehrman cries foul when Luke's gospel places the tearing of the veil in the temple before Jesus' death, while Mark puts it after the crucifixion.
In fact, I think we did this one specifically in our other book.
Right. But our authors tell us that there seems to be a simple reason for this rearrangement, right? Luke likely mentions the tearing of the veil prior to the crucifixion in order to put it besides the other cosmic signs that were happening that he was describing, right? In other words, Luke is providing a list of cosmic signs without claiming any particular order for these events. So that's one way to explain it.
So in the natural telling of the crucifixion moments, he's saying, here's certain things that happen, and he's grouped them together. He's not saying, here's exactly when they took place in this part of the story. He's saying,
all of these things happened during the crucifixion.
Here's a theme of, here's a list of all the things that happened. And it's again, we do this as well. And so to read this as, well, he's going along and then intersects this where another author doesn't. Well, is that author writing within the scope of the historical claim, or are they saying, hey, here's a list for theological purposes?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
This type of flexibility in chronology is frequent not only in the Gospels but other ancient literature. Once fundamentalist presuppositions are shed and the Gospels are allowed to be what they are and what they were intended to be, Ehrman's claims of chronological contradictions appear more skeptical than scholarly.
Good. So that's
claim number 3.
That was claim number 3, right? How about claim number 4? Claim number 4 says that the Gospels are so different in detail that they must be deemed in error at numerous points and cannot be viewed as a divinely inspired, right? So they're so different. The details are so different that obviously somebody got something wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
And this has been a historic claim within Christianity, and it seems most recently you have certain scholars who I don't question their faith. They are avid believers, strong believers, and know the Bible back and forward better than I do, but who, for the sake of either having a seat at the table or because it's just really hard, kind of divorce themselves from this narrative. And that's not always been a historical Christianity narrative. Now you can you cannot talk about it and say this isn't the scope of my talking, and so the argument from silence should be used there for scholars. But there are some scholars who say, I just don't go based on that perspective, and so we would have issues with that as well.
Right.
But here our authors talk about that no serious scholar denies that the Gospels at times differ in details. But once again, differences do not mean contradictions. This isn't an A or not A. Jason Lowell went through 420 of them and didn't find one. So, for one, Ehrman inadequately appreciates the nature of Jesus' teaching ministry. And that's very true, especially if you watch his debates. This is part of his presentation that he gives here. Jesus would travel from town to town, teaching several of the same lessons and parables in slightly different ways. If he taught a lesson once, he had no doubt would have taught the same lesson on several other occasions. In fact, I think the longest one is the Sermon on the Mount series, and that's like 20 minutes to just read through it.
Yeah, or less.
And to say that, well, that's the only time he said that. It seems weird for a teacher who's going around from town to town
and preach for almost 3 years. Right.
And so we can kind of compare this to the Gettysburg Address, right? Well, we know what the Gettysburg Address was. Well, yeah, except it was written on pretty much the back of an envelope, right? And it was sent out in different ways to different people who heard it at different times from different people. So which one's the Gettysburg Address, right? The original, back to the sources. So here, to say that Jesus didn't reteach things or taught things 100% the same way all the time, I mean, we don't do that.
Right.
Right. So this not only helped carve the sayings and lessons in the minds of the disciples, because they probably heard it over and over again.
Right, yeah.
It also meant that there was some variations in how Jesus told particular stories or truths, taught certain truths. And again, we should let the authors be free within the scope of being truthful.
Yeah, good. So Jesus also likely taught different moral lessons using similar language and similar words, right? For example, Ehrman implies that Matthew 12:30 and Mark 9:40 are contradictory because in Matthew, Jesus says, anyone who is not with me is against me, while in Mark, Jesus says, whoever is not against us is for us, right? So Ehrman suggests that one of the evangelists simply just got confused.
Yeah.
However, Luke apparently believed that Jesus made both of these remarks at different times and did not view them as contradictory since he included both of them in the Gospel of Luke, right? Luke 9:50 and Luke 11:23.
Right, and does this create a giant thing that churches are splitting over? That people are raking their nails down their face and tearing their clothes because all of a sudden the entire Bible and their entire faith was built upon this difference, and now it's done.
Yeah.
Probably not. This seems to be making a little bit more than what it's worth. What is more is the context of Matthew 12:30 and Mark 9:40 are different. In Matthew, Jesus is aiming his comments at those who attribute Jesus' ministry to evil forces. In Mark, Jesus is acknowledging the legitimacy of someone who is casting out demons in Jesus' name. Two vastly different audiences there.
Yeah.
In light of the respective context, the most natural explanation is that Jesus uttered the two statements at different times. While the message conveyed by these two sayings are not identical, neither is it contradictory.
Yeah, they're not contradictory.
So, using a common phrase in different applications is essentially what you would find in normal talking. Ehrman has once again set the Gospels up for failure by assuming with very narrow and rigid expectations this kind of fundamental view that we looked at in previous chapters, what the Gospels should look like, and then criticizing them for not meeting his unreasonable and anachronistic. There we go. I knew that word. Standards.
Yeah. So he sets up these unreasonable standards, right? And then when the Bible doesn't meet them, he says, see, it's wrong. Right. It's contradictory. Well, no, right? Yeah. Look at your standards again, right? Yeah. Good. All right, claim 5 then is the last claim in this particular chapter, right? So we've worked our way now through the first 4 claims, and now we come to claim 5. Mm-hmm. Now, again, this chapter is talking about, is the Bible full of irresolvable contradictions, right? This is what chapter 2 is all about. So the 5th claim here says that the diversity of views within the New Testament indicates that Jesus was not originally considered, here it is, ready, to be God in any sense at all. He eventually became divine for his followers in some sense before he came to be thought of as equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense. Mm-hmm. So the idea here is there is a progression, and we'll see it here in this chapter as we go, right? Yeah. Jesus wasn't originally thought to be God, and then he eventually became God, something like that, right?
And again, if you've watched any of Bart Ehrman's presentations or debates, he always has that one joke that he repeats all the time, is that John's the only one where it talks about him being divine, because Jesus says, I am divine and you are the branches. I've heard it so many times. It's a good joke once, but it's hard just to hear it over and over again. So Bart Ehrman has experienced somewhat of an evolution himself on the subject of Christology. In Jesus Interrupted, which was published in 2009, he claims John is our only gospel that actually speaks of Jesus as divine, and argues that this belief was particular to the late first century community from which John's gospel originated. However, in Ehrman's most recent book, How Jesus Became God, he now recognizes that belief in Jesus' divinity was remarkably early. The catch is that he believes this early view meant something far less significant than what most Christians now mean by referring to Jesus' divinity. So there's the trade-off.
Yeah, good. So Ehrman argues for a trajectory in early Christian thought that evolved from Jesus being not God in any sense at all, right, to him being divine in some sense, to him being equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense, right? So you have this kind of what he calls a pyramid, right? While Ehrman's provocative proposal might play well to those who are hungry for a conspiracy theory, a closer look reveals problems with his reading of the evidence. We'll start with 2 preliminary issues concerning how Ehrman makes his argument in how Jesus became God, right? So we have this progression here, this evolution in terms of how Jesus became God in the eyes of those who believed in him, right?
So our authors say that first, Ehrman makes the case by painting a rather monolithic portrait of scholarship on this issue.
Right. So this is what everybody believes, right? All the scholars believe this, right? They're on my side.
So with his all too common rhetoric, he implies that there are sober-minded, realistic historians, that is, the majority of critical scholars who, for more than a century, have maintained that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet and concur that Jesus didn't even claim to be divine.
Yeah, this is just what they all said.
And so, I just had this discussion with someone on our YouTube comments, and obviously, once answered, you fall down a rabbit hole into more and more things that you pick apart and say, in 325, it's 16, all but 16 bishops said that Jesus wasn't divine. Yeah. Well, no, that's the whole Da Vinci Code thing. That's not accurate.
Right. And didn't happen.
And again, they weren't coming to discuss whether or not this is the case. It was a clarification on language in response to heresies out there from the Gnostics.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, all of a sudden Jesus is divine. Here we go. Let's send that out.
Right. So, all the scholars believe, we've seen this kind of deal, right, before. Right. So the problem is that Ehrman, once again, has not really given his readers the whole story.
The rest of the story.
That's right. In fact, on the same day that his book, How Jesus Became God, was released, a 5-scholar team published a full-fledged response to Ehrman.
Yeah.
Right? So Ehrman should not claim to speak for the majority of serious scholars when his responses includes 5 first-rate scholars who teach on 3 continents and in 4 countries, Australia, Canada, England, United States, and institutions such as Cambridge University, right? So clearly not all scholars believe, right?
So his is how God became Jesus. How Jesus became God is.
How God became Jesus.
Right. That's his.
Oh, that's the scholars.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good play on words.
Yeah. So his was how Jesus became God,
and how God became Jesus,
and their response was how God became
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. And so it does a good job, and we provide the links below if you want to purchase that. Second, Ehrman's approach to the process of historical inquiry predetermines that he will reach skeptical conclusions about the person of Jesus. So again, what do we always talk about? Presuppositions. Presuppositions help inform what you allow in, what you keep out. And so that's what he's doing here. In the revealing section of how Jesus became God, Ehrman explains his approach to history. He writes this: "It is not appropriate for a historian to presuppose a perspective or worldview that is not generally held." So the question is, generally held by whom, right?
Yeah.
That's the big thing. If you're going to kind of count heads, count noses, I think you say, then, do you count all believers? Oh, well, no, they're not scholarly. Right. Okay, well, what about those who have come before? Well, no, those don't count because this is modern scholarship. Right. Okay, well, what about those who are doing modern scholarship who are believers? Well, no, they don't count because they're biased. Right. Okay, well, you keep drawing your circle smaller, and then you say, well,
So these are the scholars, right? These are all the scholars.
Right. Yeah. Not saying that he's a lone wolf out there in the desert, but it's saying it's not taking into a full menagerie of different perspectives that you should want to respond against. Later he writes, historically, established by historians, is based on shared presuppositions. So again, presuppositions don't matter, but then they do matter. And so we would agree, yes, they do matter. And so you should at least be clear that, hey, with my presuppositions in place, I don't take Bible-believing scholars as being the best, because I want someone who comes at this from a skeptical standpoint. So only what the skeptics say is right. When they say this actually happened, then you can take it to the bank.
That's right, because he was a skeptic.
Right.
So for Ehrman, historical inquiry cannot allow for any possibility and certainly not point to any conclusion that God is involved in the world in specific ways, right? Hence, historic Christian conclusions are off the table before anyone ever sits down at the table. Mm-hmm. Right. So even though Ehrman's justification for such a move is kind of far from convincing, right? There are plenty of historians who do not share his naturalistic presuppositions, right? In other words, if we say that God, the idea that God is involved in the world in specific ways has to be taken off the table. Well, wait a minute. Now we have some presuppositions, and so in other words, no supernatural events can happen.
Right.
Therefore, only natural events, we have to explain this naturally. Well, wait a minute. Yeah. Why can't no supernatural events happen?
I don't want a seat at that table.
Yeah.
You've essentially taken my response from me. I don't appreciate that.
Yeah.
And we see this similar thing with things like the Jesus Seminar. And so they put their little pebble into a jar, and they say, well, when it says Jesus walked on water, it really means he walked by the water. And then people can go out and say, well, modern scholarship has said that what the best translation of this is that Jesus walked on the water, or walked by the water.
Yes.
So he's walking on the shore, so his feet get a little wet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's it.
So why do that? Because supernatural events are off the table. Right.
But if they put their little white pebble in, then here it's you can take that one to the bank because they're so skeptical that you don't get the whole New Testament in there.
Right, and so again, there are plenty of scholars who don't share this naturalistic presupposition that he has. Right. Yeah.
So, however, we want to direct attention to some issues with the major planks of his argument. First, in contrast, Ehrman's claim Christianity did not elevate Jesus to a demigod, this small g, as a result of interface with pagan and Jewish traditions, and as an initial step towards being recognized later as a big G God.
Right. So the claim here is that, well, at first, because of the pagan and Jewish traditions that were going around at the time, Christianity only thought that Jesus was kind of a demigod. Right. They were so influenced by the Greeks and the Jews and that sort of thing,
right.
that this is what they came up with, right?
And this is more the Gnostic understanding of who Jesus is, the demiurge, and is referring to the Old Testament God as this malicious, smaller deity that seems different than Yahweh out there.
Yeah, right. So they were so influenced, right? The problem here is that Ehrman is skipping too quickly over the uniqueness of the Christians' claims concerning Jesus.
This seems to be an influence to his understanding of the Bauer hypothesis, which, again, a heresy of orthodoxy really does a good job of dismantling, or at least going through the claims of Bauer and then showing how inaccurate he tends to be with his claims. Right.
So instead of being totally influenced by these pagan and Jewish ideas that were floating around, the worship of a crucified and risen Messiah was definitely a unique situation. Right? It was different and incredibly scandalous to all of its audiences, whether they were Jewish or Greek.
Having a small g God in Rome was a normal thing. In fact, Rome said, you can have whatever God that you want as long as you say that Caesar is also God, or that you don't disavow our other gods and become atheists that way. So see, even the Romans, the pagan Romans, didn't like atheists. And so, why were Christians persecuted? Why did Eusebius say, 80 years that I have not that God hasn't faltered for me. Why should I deny him in this time? Having this perspective that comes rooted in a monotheistic religion of Judaism is carried over, and that's clearly seen, especially in the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah. So instead of being influenced by Greek pagans and Jewish concepts, and therefore having Jesus as a small g demigod, Christianity was unique.
Yeah, who are they hiding from then?
They were unique, right? It was unique. It was different and unaccepted by both Greeks and Jews, right?
So secondly, Ehrman's claim, contrary to Ehrman, there is strong evidence that Jesus claimed the prerogatives and identified himself as God. Ehrman's portrait of Jesus gives short shrift to the miracles, actions, and words of Jesus that point to his own divinity. He also does not allow the confessions and worship of Jesus as God by his followers immediately following the resurrection, like Matthew 28:17, Luke 24:52, John 20:28, to contribute sufficiently to the picture. As again, I think I mentioned last episode or the episode before, Thomas says, unless if I thrust my fingers into the side of Jesus, then that's the only way I'll believe. Right. Jesus appears before him. He says, all right, do it. And he says, my Lord and my God. Yeah. So this isn't like, how people would say, oh my God, this is crazy. No, this is titles that he's attributing. And Jesus doesn't go, whoa, hold on. You mean small g? Yeah. So small g God, right?
You mean demigod.
Hold on now. Let's not go too far, Thomas. I've raised myself from the dead and I'm standing before you with holes in me, but let's calm it down. No, that's not the case here.
So clearly this allowing for confessions and worship of Jesus as God was right there very early, right? Immediately after the resurrection, right?
We see that in the Corinthians passages, having Paul use a very creedal song used that where it was passed down, that most scholars do agree. Most scholars, scholars am I talking about?
That's right.
Most scholars agree is an infant type of song that the early church sang, and it talks about Jesus' divinity.
Yeah, good. So this is, this is evidence that it wasn't an evolution that Jesus became God, but very early on he was accepted, he was worshipped, and that sort of thing, right? Third, it's implausible that New Testament authors would have included contradictory Christologies, right? That is, conceptions and descriptions of Christ, side by side in the same book, right? These suggest that these ideas are related by the biblical authors to each other and not seen as competing. So here's a couple of examples. John 1 affirms that the Word was God, right? John 1:1. Then later in the same prologue, John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and took up residence among us.
Right.
So he was God, and then he wasn't God, right? Well, which is it? Well, it's both, right? They're side by side. The Word was God. The Word became flesh, right? He was man. Yep. So, yes, right there.
Well, in verse 13, John went to go get a drink. He went to the bathroom. He washed his hands. he finished the TV show he was watching, and then he came back and was like, "Well, where was I again?" All right, here we go.
He's a man.
He came down. I guess I don't know. Yeah. Let's keep going. I've got a lot to write here. I've got to get to the end of the book. Colossians 1:19 gives us what Ehrman thinks is completely different from an earlier exaltation Christologies. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Yet later in Colossians 2:12, so again, Colossians 1:19, and yet in 2:12, Paul refers to the exaltation of Christ when God raised him from the dead.
So he is God, right? All the fullness of deity dwells in him, but he isn't God because God raised him from the dead.
Right.
Well, he's both. Right, and they're both together in the same passage, right? And these authors don't see this as a contradiction,
right? And again, it's what we've said on the show before, is that it seems like the inclusion of the doctrine of the Trinity happens in the pages between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a reason you don't see Paul say, "Okay, hold on, let me pause here and talk about how God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Christ, therefore." Identifying Jesus as God, and then saying, well, and then you might be confused when I say later that God raised him from the dead. Well, what am I talking about? Here, let me go into a full-on, another book on this. Yeah. No, it seems like there's an understanding. There's no outcry of like, oh, well, we're all monotheists. You don't see that from Hebrews. You see a continuation of these people who need to be exalted not on the nature of who Christ is, but on the nature of what he accomplished. Ehrman's evolutionary theory might have some initial plausibility if these differences were seen only in different books, but the fact that these differences are in the same book makes his theory problematic, to say the least. Right. Not saying it's wrong, we would say it's wrong, but not saying that you can wholly dismiss it, but it seems really interesting here in the scope of a single chapter, and here 2 chapters, that two major writers of the New Testament, Paul and John, would conflate these ideas, saying, "Oh, well, hold on. What I mean is demigod."
Right.
I mean, a little lower than the angels.
Yeah, good. So fourth, Ehrman either misinterprets or fails to engage with several very important passages. Ehrman argues that neither in Matthew nor in Luke is Jesus seen as a pre-existence, right, prior to his birth, but instead becomes divine in some lesser sense of the word. According to Ehrman, the Gospel of Mark also does not view Jesus as pre-existent, and puts his adoption, right, even later than the other synoptics at his baptism, right? So his adoption by God, this is my son, where he's adopted by God.
This point
at
in
the
history,
baptism, right? Yeah. So he interprets Mark in this way because there is no account of the virgin birth, and he sees the voice of God at Jesus' baptism as marking a declaration, right, that during this event, Jesus is becoming the Son of God. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, right?
However, as Simon Gathercole points out, God says something similar in Mark 9:7. Okay. But clearly Jesus is not being adopted again. He says, it's hard to see how the voice at the baptism could refer to God's adoption of Jesus, and the similar sounding voice at the Transfiguration could mean something different.
Yeah, so is he adopted at the baptism and then readopted at the Transfiguration when God says, "This is my beloved Son"? Here, right?
Listen to him. Okay, hold on. Yeah. In a key scene in the Synoptics in Matthew 26 and then in Mark 14, Jesus claims he will sit with God in heaven, appealing to Psalm 110, as well as Daniel 7 in Matthew and Mark. The Jewish leaders accused Jesus of blaspheming because this was a claim to be equal to God, and they did not believe he could make this claim. This is equivalent to claiming divinity, and the leaders got the point.
So very early on, there was this claim to divinity.
So if we're to listen to critical scholars, the Jewish leaders were the critical scholars. Yeah. They tore their cloaks. They rent them in two, which is what they were. It was that high a blasphemy that even outside the temple, hearing this from a fellow Jew caused them to do something that showed their humility by ripping their vestments.
Yeah, and their how egregious this was to them.
Right?
Yeah.
How insulting.
Yeah, exactly. So, in summary, our position, our book tells us, is that Jesus was not a mere man who became God only later. In Jesus, God took on humanity in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Also, the types of Christology Ehrman claims as contradictory are found side by side, even intertwined in individual New Testament books, such as John's Gospel or Colossians that we looked at. So apparently these authors held both views simultaneously without considering them contradictory, right? So this calls Ehrman's alleged trajectory of this kind of evolution from exaltation to incarnation Christologies. It calls this into question. All right.
So the kind of heading for this portion is called From Credulity to Skepticism.
Right. So this is the very last section of the book,
right?
Of this chapter.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so Ehrman's journey serves as a reminder that when approaching history, we must avoid two extremes: credulity and skepticism. Right. Bart Ehrman claims to have
believing everything and believing nothing.
Right. Yeah. When it comes to the approach, now that's saying that you can't believe everything in the end, but we need to be measured and controlled when approaching things. Again, like the Bereans did against what other people did. When Paul is out there preaching, he goes before the Jewish leadership, the Jewish church, and they test him and talk to him and figure out if he's teaching what's accurate. The fact that they don't disavow him, that they continue to eat with him, that they send him on missionary journeys, shows that they agreed and supported his message.
Yeah.
So Bart Ehrman claims to have started his study of the Bible as a fundamentalist.
All right.
But through a painful process, left fundamentalism in the wake of his exposure to critical scholarship.
Yeah.
Certainly, in many ways, Ehrman is the antithesis of a fundamentalist.
Right.
Nevertheless, his rigid requirements for what the New Testament must adhere to, his own that he gives, to in order to be considered true, ironically bears striking resemblance to his fundamentalist beginnings.
Yeah.
Interesting points.
He leaves fundamentalism, but his basic beliefs are fundamental, right? In terms of his basic approach, rather, is fundamental.
Right.
Yeah.
Just believe, don't question. This is the Word of God. There's no need to look further into these things. He's just doing it for the skeptical point of view.
Right.
So
just don't believe. This isn't the Word of God.
Right. So again, we're not saying that 100% this is the view that he's coming at, but in the scope of his books, what he's writing to the popular audience, he doesn't seem to be addressing alternative viewpoints or the best explanations to what he's going about. He seems to be putting this out, and it's only when he gets into good debates with people that I think a lot of that's fleshed out. And so I don't know. When Bart Ehrman debates, it doesn't fill me with too much one way or the other, because I just don't feel like he wants to be at many of them. That's what I'm getting. But but there are a lot out there, and so you should check them out, because that's a view of scholarship where both sides get tested, and so checking them out. I know James White has debated him, especially on Bart Ehrman's claim that changes in the gospel or in the New Testament book, especially Hebrews, changes the entire scope of Hebrews, and so
Tim McGrew has debated him.
Yeah. Very, very interesting stuff on unbelievable podcasts.
Right.
So, heck, I'll link those in the description below. But there are other ones out there. Feel free. And, sometimes Bart Ehrman wins, whatever that means in the scope of debate. That's another discussion that Tim McGrew would probably have as well. So next time, chapter 3, or depending on where this comes out for the kind of holiday break that most people on, I might throw in a different change of form, and we might go back to this after that one. So, but we are going to continue on. Thanks for joining us this year. We started this show 2 years ago. And again, like I always say, we would be doing it anyways. Now we're just held to consistency. So thanks for those of you who have subscribed, who have listened, that have written emails and comments and talked about how we don't do a good job. you know what, we're going to continue on and try and do better too as well, whatever that might mean.
But I am excited about this next chapter, though. Are the biblical manuscripts corrupt?
Yeah. Again, it keeps drilling down into the areas where Bart Ehrman seems to be most known for. And so this is another one of his books. Yeah, great. So again, thank you. Share, like, subscribe, continue to listen. Even if you don't want to listen to this episode, download it. So, you fake our stat numbers, download it 16 times. Leave reviews if you want to. If not, continue to enjoy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
See you next time.